If you listen at all to the program, you know that I read an awful lot, and I can go through 2 or 3 books a week pretty easily, and I thought I would devour this book by Eric Kurlander, Hitler's Monsters, but this has taken me about a month to get through, mainly because I get sidetracked and start looking up the things that he is pointing out, because you've never heard any of this before. And it will give you a couple of things. A new look on what allowed the Nazi movement to really grow and grow deep roots for a while. And also the fact that, no, this was not a Christian movement, which a lot of people like to say, National Socialism, Hitler was a Christian. No, that was not a Christian movement. The only guy that has done serious work on the supernatural history of the Third Reich is Eric Kurlander, and he joins us now. And I want to make sure that you understand that this isn't some guy who's just like, I just did some research. He has his Ph.D. of Modern European History from Harvard, M.A. Modern European History, Harvard, B.A. History is at Bowdoin College? I'm not familiar with
Bowdoin.
That one. Bowdoin College, sorry.
Bowdoin, yeah.
Belgian, okay. Well, welcome. I'm a huge fan of this book. Thank you for, how many years did it take you to compile all this?
Well, thank you, Glenn, for having me on. I really appreciate it. I watched the show many years ago when Robert Galately, one of my colleagues at Florida State University, was on. I think in a book comparing Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini. And I appreciated the way you brought in academic historians into your conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me on. And like many academic monographs, it took me a good 8 to 10 years from conception to going to archives and doing the due diligence, reading other people's work, and then finally starting writing, presenting it, and eventually deciding I had a critical mass of information to make my arguments. And it doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a reviewer somewhere who's like, well, you could have looked at that or this. But as you point out, it's pretty dense already. I mean, at some point, you've got to say,
enough.
You're ready.
Yeah.
And get it out there.
There's a couple of things, and I want you to kind of lead this a bit. I want to ask you a couple of questions up front that I think show the depth of your research. One, you went, and this fascinated me, you went to the detail of looking at books that Hitler had collected and had read, and you looked for things he underlined. And there were a couple of things that you talked about, and I can only find one of them now as I was looking this morning. But one that he underlined was horror always lurks at the bottom of the magical world, and everything holy is always mixed with horror. This comes from a book called Magic in 1923. He underlined this, and there was also another quote about something about truly great man has to have the seeds of a demon inside of him.
That he did underline. The other quote's from a page that he had underlined, but he hadn't underlined that particular quote. And I want to be very clear about this because this is an important methodological point. A fellow historian, a journalist who writes history, found the book in the Library of Congress where we have Hitler's library. And it seems to be underlined and annotated in the way that Hitler had annotated other books. We're not 100% certain he read and annotated it, but he's the most likely suspect. So I use this book to represent, a kind of cultural milieu in which he may have been thinking, because it seems that he read it. And then I tie in other sources that talk about Hitler seeming to, be interested in parapsychology, magic, even if he just thinks it's a way to manipulate people and not an actual force in the universe. He clearly was involved in that kind of milieu. That's the point I'm making. And it does appear that he underlined 66 passages in that book. But as someone who is I'm not a specialist in handwriting, I don't know for certain that he did. I just want to put that out there.
So, Eric, the other thing I thought would be important to start with to show the depth of your research was, you go back into the 1800s and you're really trying to lay out the mindset of Germans at that time. And I was not aware, and you talk a lot about the films that were made, the silent films in the teens and the 20s. And I went back, and I don't remember which one I watched, but I watched one of these silent films that you pointed out in your book, and it is terrifying. And the distortion of the Jew into a monster, or later Nosferatu, the vampire, is terrifying that went on so long without the Nazis.
Right. So a number of film scholars and literary scholars have argued that Weimar, because of all the trauma it went through, the way that people in Weimar processed it was through horror, through expressionism, through very kinds of avant-garde artistic media that were, channeling a kind of return of the repressed, right? And I try to show the ways in which certain images, monstrous images of the other, right? Jews, Slavs, communists, were portrayed in not an empirical way. Here's what's going to happen to the economy if finance capital does that or the communists do this, but in a metaphysical or supernatural way, right? And I'm trying to show how that culture precedes the Nazis. It doesn't mean everyone who watched horror movies was a Nazi, but their way of processing trauma and crisis, I argue, was influenced by a kind of supernatural thinking.
How much of this came from the churches? I know the churches in the West, in England, et cetera, many of them were really damaged because of World War I. And the people were kind of shook from that, and they kind of started to see, wait a minute, the church is just really kind of a political organ here. How much of this return to magic in Germany came from the churches kind of selling out or not being what churches should be?
That's an excellent question, and you're not going to want me to get into too much detail here. But what I will say is I point out in Chapter 1 that Max Weber, the famous sociologist who was alive at the time, said clearly the traditional churches in the wake of hyper-industrialization, even before World War I, and science, are no longer providing the kind of answers for a lot of people, a lot of younger people living certainly in cities that they used to provide. And yet, with this disenchantment of the world, right, people still need something higher than themselves. They need faith in something. If science isn't going to do it and traditional religion doesn't do it, what's in between? Well, New Age religion, occultism, these so-called border sciences that claim to explain everything, like world ice theory, but really can't be proven empirically, that's a vehicle for faith. Pulp fiction, science fiction. And we see that across the West after the 1890s and especially after World War I with the decline in traditional religion. We even see some of the Catholic and Protestant leaders trying to tap into that more grassroots, supernatural way of thinking. But what I argue, and I guess this is something that, as you point out in the intro, it would be reassuring for you as someone who believes Judeo-Christian ethos in the West, it's usually to the degree that they move away from that they're open to these new ways of thinking. I don't find a lot of devout Catholics and Protestants who believe in world ice theory, for example.
Right.
But they're compatible because they're both faith-based ways of thinking. But I do think you've got to take a step away from traditional religion towards what I would call border science or occultism in order to find that as your kind of new religion, right? So you're right that while the churches may have made certain concessions to it or, like you say, become too political, I don't think that Christianity per se was a bridge to this kind of thinking.
And I don't mean it exactly that way. I mean the absence of that thinking led people to go find something that was different and worked. I want to have you explain border science and things like that when we come back, and kind of get in and set the groundwork of what they actually believed and what they used. I mean, the idea that they were using astrologers and divining rods to find submarines is amazing. And eventually the miracle weapons that they were going after, and the reason why possibly they did not get the bomb is an amazing revelation. And we'll get to that here in just a second. This is Indiana Jones and the, Holy Grail and the Last Crusade. It is the Ark of the Covenant and Captain America, but it's the real stuff. It's amazing. Eric, help me out. Let's get a couple of definitions. Define the occult. What does that mean? Is that devil stuff?
Right. So I started out thinking, I'm going to look at occultism, whatever that means. And then I realized that occult is a pretty specific meaning for scholars. It's things related to demonology, witchcraft, certain what I later call border sciences, but really that are linked to things like astrology and dowsing, and doctrines like Ariosophy or anthroposophy. These are also things that usually come under the umbrella of occultism, something that's between religion and science and will help you uncover a secret world or a hidden world, right? That's where the term comes from.
Pretend I read the book, but still could not get my arms around the Osophies. Can you define those?
Excellent question. And again, these Osophies are larger doctrines which supposedly explain the world in ways that traditional religion and science can't, because they integrate both. So Theosophy, which Madame Blavatsky, a Russian thinker in the mid to late 19th century, came up with, is this idea that if you study the religions of the East and the kind of practices of the East and unite it with Darwinism and evolution, you can come up with syncretic doctrine that explains all of world history. So she came up with this idea of root races, the most superior of which lived in Atlantis millennia earlier, maybe mated with extraterrestrials. And then these other races, which had various qualities. You know, the early Theosophists were not as explicitly racist as the later Anthroposophists or Ariosophists, obviously with Aryan in the title, but they all believed in this idea of root races, that modern biology and Darwinism make sense, but it's got to be leavened with Eastern philosophy and religion, and that you can understand the stages of world history through that. And if you reverse engineer everything, you can get back in touch, both spiritually and racially, with the great root races of the earlier period. And so much of what they were doing was having seances and following certain doctrines to try to get back in touch with humanity when it was at its highest point. You can see why that was attractive to some Central Europeans in the folkish movement, the more racialist political movements and anti-Semitic movements, because it, in a way, justified their view of the world.
So, Eric, I just want to go back. I was interested to read how much they were into Eastern religion, and I can't remember, was it Himmler that carried around the sayings of Buddha in his pocket?
The Bhagavad Gita. It's not exactly the same thing. But yeah, Himmler, Hess, Rudolf Hess, the deputy Fuhrer, Walter Darré.
This would not be something that people would expect.
No, but it makes perfect sense when you think about what is their larger view of the world. Why do they use the swastika, which is an Indo-Aryan fertility symbol, right?
Right.
Because in their mind, coming out of this 19th century supernatural imaginary, the first chapter, they recognize that the great races and civilizations, and of course we don't have scientific evidence for this, but this is their view of the world, all came from these Indo-Aryan races, which may have developed in Atlantis or the Hyperborea, some ancient Aryan or racially pure Atlantean civilization, but at some point, because of a flood or giant blocks of ice, did migrate east, thereby populating India, East Asia, Japan, and the reason all these superior civilizations occurred is because of the leadership of the Indo-Aryans, for whom the symbol of the swastika is and the religion of Tibet. Why Tibet? Well, it's a high point where in a flood, a lot of the high priests of Aryan religion could have fled, and then they're trying to reinscribe those ideas back into their view of Nordic race and religion in the 20s and 30s. So that's kind of their view of the world. So it's not that odd. They just skip over the Slavs and Jews, right? Because those are subhuman races, or Africa.
All right.
But Asia makes sense to them.
What was in the society that made them embrace Nazism, and what did the Nazis use to strengthen that embrace?